Thank you very much to XTN for inviting me along, and for all of you for attending. Two of the things I've tracked in the past have been AML and fraud detection, and more I see these two things overlapping. We see this rapid convergence. So I want to talk a little bit about the insights and perspectives we have around the trends and challenges that banks in particular are facing as we come across a rising volume of financial crime and increasing sophistication. It's one of the unfortunate facts of life that all the new technologies are a wonderful boon for most of us, but unfortunately, sadly, inevitably, the criminals use them as well. So it's always a continuing arms race and we hope that we come out on top, and hopefully there are some very positive signs that we can actually do that. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit later about a survey which has literally come back from the field this week. XTN participated in that, and I think another 32 firms, and I managed to aggregate early. It's not been published yet, this survey about AML, but I've got 27 replies back, and there's some interesting insights there, some hard evidence about what sort of trends we're seeing, where are vendors heading, what kind of things are banks demanding. But we can't have any presentation, any webinar these days without addressing this particular elephant in the room. And that elephant, of course, is generative AI. So what impact is Gen AI having here? Now, if you asked me this 6 months ago, I would probably have said it's not having any impact. And I didn't really foresee how quickly that would change. I mean, one of the things is that generative AI is very good at generating more data, but we already have lots of data here. We have billions of transactions. Why would we need more? But in fact, it does have a useful role to play in sometimes helping to extract the signal amongst all that noise. So this is what I'm starting to see. And it's early days, I would stress, and we'll see that again later in the presentation when I'll talk a little bit about some of the survey findings. But we are seeing that both banks and vendors are augmenting what they already have with Gen AI. So I don't see Gen AI replacing machine learning. It's not going to replace anything at the heart of our fraud detection and AML systems anytime soon, but it is already starting to play a peripheral role, which is significant. So what do I see? Generally, I see that banks have started to use it to generate data to simulate attacks. What kind of attacks might we see tomorrow? That is not by definition in the historical data because they're new kinds of attacks. They're using it for content discovery, which I kind of think of as like search engines on steroids. Where can we find anomalies that may not be present in the transaction data? And for more prosaic things like report generation, a lot of that stuff like suspicious activity reports is still done manually. It's a manually intensive job. A lot of that could be automated. So that's where I see banks augmenting what they have. The vendors are doing something similar, also generating data for stress testing. Will the systems be proof against tomorrow's kind of attacks? Can we predict what those new kinds of attacks might look like? Quite often the criminals at the moment, and I don't know how long it'll stay like this, the evolution, the mutation of their attacks often follows a predictable trajectory. So sometimes we can predict what it might look like. And then again, some more prosaic things like low code, no code, documenting changes to rules and machine learning features, and helping with the workflow, chatbots, co-pilots for navigating the fraud tool. As I said, sadly, but inevitably, the fraudsters are also exploiting this technology. Deep fakes are going to get more convincing. Phishing attacks are going to be more sophisticated. We can't rely on poor spelling and grammar giving them away. So we do need to do something here to maintain that vigilance. And this is the first of those places where I've taken some of the feedback, which we literally got this week. I think the survey is closing today. And this is what we see. So at the moment, when I ask vendors, and there's 27 vendors when I took this snapshot, when I ask them, where are you using Gen AI, for which use case, you can see there's a wide variety of use cases. At the moment, it's mostly being applied to the more pragmatic use cases. So where can we pre-populate AML reports? Can we generate AML reports? So taking away some of the manual burden there, speeding it up, making it more accurate. Can we build co-pilots to help with the workflow? These are often complex systems, and also case investigators over the years tend to develop their own particular method of doing investigations. They get quite idiosyncratic. So they're not always consistent. They're not always optimal. Co-pilots can help with that, especially with the less experienced investigators. And as we'll see later, banks are adding investigators often as fast as they can, reluctantly, but they're increasing the size of those departments. Things like predicting new kinds of attacks, that is relatively unpopular at the moment, but you can see, over 20%. That's not insignificant. So early days, but pragmatic use cases tend to be prioritized at the moment. So what are the big challenges in the FAML world? So that combination of fraud and AML. The first is that a lot of this is driven in the AML world by regulators. They have a preference for business rules, which are easy to understand. They give a sort of basic guarantee of compliance. You tick the box, and yet they are increasingly frustrated about the poor accuracy of a lot of the old incumbent systems. So there is a propensity for banks to try and add more artificial intelligence, in particular machine learning, because those accuracy rates, basically when banks, if there's any room for suspicion, any doubt, they tend to fire off an activity report. So false positive rates are very high. It's not uncommon for them to be at 95% or higher. So they tend to be extremely cautious. That means that regulators spend a lot of time looking at things which are actually false positives. The other thing is speed. Case investigators can spend a long time investigating an AML suspect and yet still get it wrong, as I pointed out in that false positive rate. So accuracy and productivity are probably the two big issues. And again, when we get to what is driving the replacement of AML systems, we'll see those come up to the top. There are other things. I mentioned the swelling size of those departments, both the people who have to train the machine learning, as we see, they're adding more and more machine learning to try and improve that accuracy, to try and improve the true positives compared to the false positives. But data scientists are a rare commodity. It's hard to hire enough of them. That's pretty much for everybody, but especially small banks. And case investigators, they're not so difficult to hire, but they're difficult to afford because we're just hiring more and more of them. So that's why productivity comes to the top. I mentioned that capability to try and predict what will tomorrow's attacks look like. Well, as long as we rely on historical data, we're always going to be a little deficient in that respect, because the attacks are forever evolving. They don't stay the same. So historical data is useful up to a point, but if you really want to improve that accuracy, you have to be able to have some idea of where they may be heading in future. Banks obviously want to know what those new kind of attacks look like. They'd love to know what their peers are seeing, but they hate sharing data. Is there some way to resolve that paradox? Could we be more informed without giving away confidential information or competitive information. And there's a wide number of systems. AML tends to be an umbrella term that covers a multitude of sins. So we have all kinds of different systems. Again, I'll show you some data about that. And it's important to try and integrate them better. So going back to the whole FRAML premise, because at the moment, unless they're integrated, we lack the big picture. We can see the detail, oddly enough, but we don't see the big picture. It's kind of like one of those pointillist paintings, Seurat or somebody. We can see the individual dots, but we don't see the big picture. And that means that criminals can exploit those gaps because we're not seeing the patterns, the clusters, the spikes. So those are some of the major challenges. You can see I mentioned, would show some data about what is driving banks to replace their AML systems. And top of the bunch by quite some margin is low productivity and the high total cost of ownership of the current systems. They're too slow, they're too inaccurate. There's a lot of manual effort involved. They need a lot of people to do those case investigations. Interestingly, banks don't seem to be replacing AML systems simply because the new kinds of financial crime are arising. So it's whilst I think that is an issue, perhaps they feel they're kind of on top of that, but the low productivity, they are not, and the low detection rates and accuracy. You can see those are the top two things. And the other drivers tend to be just variations on the same theme. In terms of what they're looking for in a new AML system, this is where we get to that holistic or enterprise-wide strategy. They need a more integrated and comprehensive end-to-end platform. Again, a pretty strong consensus that that is the #1 requirement for a new AML system, and then detection rates and accuracy coming up #2. So a strong correspondence about why are we dissatisfied with the old system? What do we want in the new system? It's very consistent. So how are vendors responding to these challenges? What are people like XTN doing in response to this situation? So I was asking vendors, how do you differentiate yourselves from the competition? And you can see there's a really good mapping here between the demand from the banks and the response, the supply from the vendors. So a holistic AML portfolio was the top response. At the bottom was that one about federated learnings. That responds to the paradox about we need more insights across all the banks, but we don't want to share data. Banks are very averse to that. So you can see there's quite a strong polarization between the top response and the bottom. Second in there, explainable AI. So that goes back to regulators want you to get more accurate. That means we have to use more machine learning, maybe more generative AI. The problem then is explaining it to the regulator, proving that we are being diligent and compliant and that we have good reasons for suggesting that these things are suspicious. And how are vendors planning to improve their system? So we were asking them about what they've got in the pipeline. Again, this seems to be focused more on the pragmatic kind of thing. So workflow and automation, that would improve the productivity, the consistency in the way that case investigators work. There's a very wide diversity of things in here. Most vendors, of course, have got multiple things in the pipeline, and that might be improving their KYC capability, that AI transparency I was talking about, their risk scoring algorithms, new use cases as we get new intermediaries in the payments value chain like Zelle and Stripe and SumUp and all these people. So a very wide range here, but workflow and automation, which I think corresponds to that productivity demand, is top of the bunch. So really, I think we can delve down into 8 different categories here, 8 buckets, which I think sum up the major trends. I'll try and interject some of that data again as we look at these 8 things. So let's start off with holistic. I mean, I think we mentioned this already, but I just wanted to illustrate in a bit more detail. What does that actually mean? When you talk about holistic system, what exactly are you trying to integrate? Well, it's any and all of these things. So can we link to transaction monitoring for AML? Very strong correspondence to the fraud detection capability that XTN and people have. It's things like improving KYC, risk scoring, case investigations, and then all the other things that are specific to AML, sanction screening, watch lists, politically exposed persons, adverse media, entity resolution. Can we untangle those nests of companies and holding companies? And then linking to usually external capabilities like behavioral biometrics. So it's pretty clear that whilst banks favor this more holistic approach, vendors are responding by trying to be more of a one-stop shop, somewhere where you can fulfill all your needs. They can be a single point of contact for your AML and fraud needs. And hopefully, these portfolios of solutions will be better integrated, not simply ingesting data from each other, but actually talking and building up that big picture. It also corresponds to what is happening structurally, organizationally, not just technically. Are we integrating these systems? We also have to respond to the fact that at banks, there is more and more convergence between the teams themselves, the cybersecurity team, the fraud team, the compliance team. So it's both structural and technical. To what extent are FAML solutions a reality? Well, pretty much. I mean, I admit I wasn't expecting such a high result, but over half of vendors can now supply their solutions as a single FAML platform. Now, these are not mutually exclusive. It is also possible for them to sometimes supply this as separate modules. Other vendors can only supply them as separate modules, 37%, and some, of course, are only doing AML, but that's very much a minority. So clearly we're seeing a trend towards convergence in the platforms provided and more of a one-stop shop. So let me show you what that one-stop shop looks like. And you can see here that basically I was asking, which of those solutions that we just went through can you provide? Vendor X, vendor Y, vendor Z, and generally they can supply all of them one way or another. Behavioral biometrics was the lowest response by quite a wide margin, so they often cannot provide that. Sanction screening was the top one. You can almost always provide sanction screening. A lot of banks have got that in place already, so they don't necessarily want to replace it at the same time, but strategically they're planning for the future. Could we get these from the same vendor when they come up for renewal? The little nuance here is that the vendor doesn't always own that solution. It's not necessarily something they built in-house or acquired and since maintain in-house. Quite often they're going to a third party. So you can see that for politically exposed persons, it's 50-50. Half the time they have it as an in-house solution, half the time they're going to a third party. Client risk scoring, no, that is something fundamental to being present in this space. 100% the AML vendors will do their own risk scoring. They don't outsource that at all. Second of these buckets I was looking at, the growth of AI, and I see a number of advances here. One is, we were talking about how you cannot rely on historical data. We're seeing a corresponding shift to the increasing use of unsupervised training in near real time. So that's starting to overtake, not yet, but starting to overtake supervised training, which still has a role in first configuring that system and the machine learning model, but there's a definite trend towards unsupervised. Also, because the whole cadence of fraud and financial crime is forever increasing, so the window you have to spot it is smaller and smaller, more and more systems will automatically prompt the bank with, we think you need to make these changes, we think you need to add this machine learning feature or this business rule, or you need to update an existing business rule. That is becoming the norm. You don't wait for data scientists to spot what changes are needed. Increasingly, we rely on the system to prompt us proactively and tell us, we think you need to make these changes. And they have to be easy to deploy. So once the bank is happy, hit a button, deploy that feature. It shouldn't need a lot of manual effort. And many banks are doing this on a weekly or even a daily basis. It's not every 3 months or every 6 months as it was in the past. And as we mentioned, more use of Gen AI to augment those FAML systems, not replacing them, not kicking out the machine learning models, but augmenting them. One of the differentiators here is, have people built their own AI or data science engine, or is it purely open source? So 2/3, roughly speaking, have their own AI engine. Sometimes, of course, there's a little nuance here. It's not quite black and white. They may have built their own AI engine based on something which is open source. So it's a customized version. It may not have been built from the ground up. Still around 15% don't have any AI in. So it's not universal. How do we get ahead of the curve? So what can be done pre-transaction? I think this is something that preys on the minds of banks. It's all very well spotting anomalies once the crime has been committed, once the transactions have been posted, once the money mule is in operation. But what could we do to spot that earlier in the life cycle, before there are funds transfers and things? So, there's quite a lot of activity here, and this is where I see some niche vendors playing a role. So starting to send alerts to banks about, we think there's been a phishing attack on some of your customers. You should be warning those customers, maybe putting a hold on their cards, maybe putting a hold on their accounts. We see a shift to continuous KYC. Does their actual activity match the profile we collected at onboarding? We see that there's the emergence of large transaction models, the equivalent in this space of large language models. Could we use those to predict what the next transactions should look like, or the next criminal attack? Starting to capture payment information earlier in the life cycle. If we capture it at point of sale, we know what it looked like originally, because it may have been adapted and hacked en route to the bank. And then can we do some kind of more clever segregation of the different kinds of money mules? Not all money mules are the same. Some are the criminals, some are willing accomplices, some are unfortunate victims. The other thing that we haven't mentioned at all at the moment is, where is this stuff being hosted? So I do see a gradual shift away from on-premise. I think that's happening more slowly in AML than it is in fraud detection. So on-premise still dominates if you did a poll today, but it's only moving in one direction. There is going to be more use of cloud and software as a service models. So the question really is, to what extent is that going to be private cloud, or the vendor's cloud, or public cloud like AWS or Azure? And this is mostly about compliance and cost, being on the latest software, the latest machine learning model. It's got relatively little to do with cost. It might have more to do in future with, can we share some of those insights, that federated learning that relies on aggregated data across many banks, which the vendor can see without doing any data sharing, without compromising any privacy? Could we deliver insights to everybody? So a safety in numbers aspect. I think that's another key driver for moving to a software as a service model. So you can see that, I was asking vendors, to what's the situation now and where do you see the future? And it is gradually shifting away from on-premise. It's not dropping off a cliff, and it is moving towards vendor cloud, and perhaps surprisingly, to me at least, a strong shift to public cloud. That is growing the fastest, although vendor cloud will probably be the largest in future. Talent crisis, we talked about there just not being enough experts, so we do need those productivity gains. How can we do more with the people we've already got, rather than always hiring more and more and more case investigators? And many banks have over 1,000. Could we make them more productive? And on the data science side, we talked about, can you know, that auto-tuning the machine learning model? Could the vendor maintain it on our behalf if you're a small bank? So all those automatic suggestions. So again, making the data scientists more productive rather than always hiring more of them. I also mentioned at the beginning, you know, the whole point of a one-stop shop and a more holistic approach. One of the big things there was better integration. We do see as well the use of graphical graph databases here to give that different interface, because it's important to see that big picture. One of the vendors, you know, described the situation. If you don't do this, if you're only operating at the transactional level, at the single nodes where you see the bad actors, you're just playing a game of whack-a-mole. You're stamping out the immediate problem, the symptom, but you're doing nothing to address the cause. To address the cause, you've got to find the AML network. Only then are you going to have a significant impact. And you do that by understanding the patterns. Where are the clusters? Where are the spikes? Then we can have a more significant impact. And of course, you know, at the very beginning, I was talking about, well, you know, we don't really need more data. The systems, you know, tend to be extremely good at ingesting data, not so great at exporting it. I think this is one of the gaps that we see in the vendor landscape when banks say, I've got all this fantastic data in my fraud systems, in my AML systems. I need that in my enterprise dashboard. I need that in my data warehouse, my data lake. This is where, you know, there is less help directly available. But there is, you know, I think, a strong effort, at least within the systems, to do more about data orchestration, more about process orchestration. Again, you know, these things are not mutually exclusive. Quite a lot of vendors, I think, have got a third-party solution and then customized it to be their own solution. But what you are getting is something that is dedicated to AML. So around about 90% of vendors will have something that is uniquely dedicated to this solution. So it's not off-the-shelf data or process orchestration. It is dedicated to this system. Last bit from me, I think this is another underexploited area. And this is, I suppose, something that sits in parallel with fraud systems and AML systems, and that is banks' use of RegTech. And this is, I think, a bit of a Cinderella. It's the poor relation that sort of bubbles under and nobody talks about it very much, not to me anyway. And I think that AI could really revolutionize this area. Could we take new regulations, as new regulations appear, could we use AI, and particularly Gen AI, to analyze what does all that text means? The next time 1,000 pages of dense legal stuff arrives on my desk, could I use Gen AI to actually translate it into stuff that means something to my business? Could I then use that technology to assess the gap between what the bank has, the as is, and what we need to do to comply, the to be? So tell me what those gaps are. Tell me what the next best actions are to close those gaps. What do I need to do to apply to my systems? Do I need new business rules? And then tell the people who've got the power to make that change. Don't broadcast it to the whole bank. Tell the people with the power to make a difference. So that was my quick run through. I hope that was useful. After Guido and Céline, I'm happy to take any questions, but I thought now we should concentrate on catching the bad guys. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pete. Thank you for sharing some great insights on the convergence of fraud and AML. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Can you see my screen? I think it should work. And take the time the next 15 minutes or so to present XTN, really provide a quick understanding of who we are, what we do, and our approach to fraud prevention and AML, and dive into a specific use case around money muling and explaining our proactive approach to hunt money mulers. So XTN, let's see. XTN Cognitive Security was founded in 2014, 10 years ago. And it stems from a group of consultants who had built expertise in cyber security and fraud prevention in large financial institutions, and really felt the need to bring some efficiencies around investigations and fraudulent activity. And so encoded their human skills in machine learning algorithms to address and be able to develop techniques around behavioral passive biometrics, behavioral profiling. XTN is able to really help financial institutions, our customers, from a holistic approach when it comes down to where our solution is integrated. So on the various digital channels, and when we think about the end user's journey, really being able to analyze the end user's behavior on various touch points, whether it's at the account onboarding phase, whether it's at login, wherever the password is reset, critical actions within the account. So if the end user is changing personal information, if there are activities, so looking at the payment activity as well. So that's where we are typically integrated with the mindset to really be able to provide highlights, genuine users, and creating the least amount of friction for those users, and doing quite the opposite for fraudsters, right? Creating friction, being able to block real-time bad actors. And so we are a private company. We have been acquired at the beginning of 2024 by Cyphergate Group, and really looking forward to synergies and working together with Cyphergate. Over the years, we've expanded, and we have being headquartered in Italy. We have also offices in North America, and to the point today where we're able to monitor over 2 billion events per month, and over 150 million devices, whether it's in a mobile or web context, with our app protection feature. And we are able to, let me take this down. We're looking at and really focused on providing a high efficiency rate, combining high fraud capture with low false positives. So we wanted to share the use cases, typical use cases, the most critical ones that we at XTN help our customers with, going from new account fraud to account takeover, looking at payment fraud, card fraud, financial malware, bot attacks, and one critical one that is important to financial institutions these days is authorized push payment fraud. Now, the one use case that I'm going to focus on today is money mule. So we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Before we talk about money mules in more details, I wanted to address the question around the synergy between fraud and fraud detection and AML being integrated into one unique solution. We at XTN historically were coming from the fraud prevention side. And in working with our existing customers, working with also addressing the needs from smaller digital banks, we felt that it was really natural to move to being able to offer a platform that addresses both fraud and AML. We also feel strongly about being able to provide a real-time evaluation. So being able to generate an AML risk score in a matter of a few hundred milliseconds, to be able to provide an evaluation to ensure that we're able to help our customers to keep their operational expenses in check. One of the core elements within our approach is user behavior. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about user behavior analysis, and that is something that is really important and critical for us to help our clients identify suspicious behaviors. Then we are able to accommodate for external third-party AML list providers to be fed and enrich the transactional data via API or batch. And then finally, it's essential, as Pete mentioned it earlier, to take in consideration the dozens of machine learning algorithms that we've developed to really focus and target specific use cases and help AML analysts and fraud analysts to cut down on the manual work that they have to do. So if we look at our AML capabilities, we feel strongly about providing a unique environment to evaluate transactional risk. We know that with the evolution of payments, knowing that there's a huge increase in instant payments, it's essential to be able to evaluate risk in real time, right? The AML requirements are really shifting in that direction. And so we at XTN are able to provide real-time evaluation. We also are providing capabilities around orchestrations, being able to feed our customers are able to feed additional data and being able to also, from our standpoint, push some of the evaluation data to other third parties. And then money muling hunting capabilities, being that we're able to detect fake and synthetic accounts, along with being able to monitor and raise suspicion around payment information and funds coming in the account, funds going out of the account. The critical risk indicators that we can highlight are looking at the account activity, being able to provide watch lists and data registries, making sure that we have we're delivering pattern analysis and velocity rules for our clients, looking at checks around the source of fund, and again looking at the user's behavior, understanding from a new user's perspective how they're comparing to the average user and how they're interacting with the site, and being able to raise suspicions around that, along with looking at existing users that are interacting with the web, on the web or a mobile app within an account, and understanding their type of behavior to highlight risk. So if we dive into our proactive approach to money mule hunting, I'd like to take a moment to go over the different phases of the money mule, typical money mule activities. So what we typically see at first is an account that is being created as a fake account with synthetic ID. And what we'll see as well is that oftentimes we're able to detect that the end user, from the same endpoint, there will be several accounts created, right? Not just one. The second stage is typically seeing some funds coming into those fake accounts after they've been dormant for a while, and raising suspicions around where those funds are coming from. And then their third phase would be the cash out, when funds are leaving the account to go to a suspicious destination. So if we take the time to look at how XTN is addressing the first phase, which is the fake account registration, there are several things that we look at. One is behavioral anomalies. So typically, the fraudster will demonstrate a lack of confidence in writing personal information, because it's obviously not their own information. They can't use their long-term memory, and so they're hesitating. So we're able to detect this kind of behavior. Then there will likely be a lot of copying and pasting and chunking of the information coming from a fraudster rather than a genuine user. And as I mentioned before, typically in the case of money muling, we'll see a lot of accounts being opened, all from the same endpoint, and therefore that typically means that the fraudster has become quite confident interacting with the registration process. So a demonstration of excessive savviness is typical in this use case. And then another thing that we also are able to detect is the frequent recycling of personal information. As they typically open so many accounts, they don't bother oftentimes to create new email addresses and purchase new phone numbers. And so we'll see those being reused for several account openings. So that's the first stage and the typical detection techniques that we apply at new account opening. And then second stage being when the funds are coming in, and again, after scene, we'll be able to detect that the account has been dormant for a while, and then noticing numerous fraudulent transactions coming into the account. And so the techniques we apply here are behavioral analysis techniques, looking at watch lists being sanctions list, being PEPs list, being terrorist financing lists that we can feed into our system and leverage in watch lists, looking at the originator's information, so looking at the source of fund, being able to assess the legitimacy of the originator, and also scrutinizing the payment reason, and then also checking on the payee and the payee names. And then the last phase would be cash outs. So when funds are going out, and in that regards, what we notice is that there is typically after the funds have come in, that there's just one single transaction with funds going out, in general going to a foreign bank account or a cryptocurrency wallet. So similar techniques here, where we apply behavioral analysis techniques, watch list checks, velocity rules, and looking at anomalies around where the end user might be located, where the funds are going out, if it's a foreign country, those type of analysis. So to conclude on money mule detection, I think it's critical to understand that at XTN we don't only focus on ID fraud. We focus on looking at, of course, being able to detect the fake accounts, and being able to prevent those accounts from being open in the real time, since we can act and we can send a risk score in real time, but also looking at and working with our financial institution customers. We already have existing accounts and are dealing with those accounts, being able to raise suspicion at that level as well, at that stage as well. In working with our customers, we understand and garnering their feedback. We're able to deliver a high detection rate over 95% and a high accuracy rate over 85%. XTN allows, with our technology, we're then able to really detect mules in real time. Therefore, we are helping our customers cut down on the investigation time and resources that it takes. We feel strongly about being able to help financial institutions with keeping their reputation in check. Also being able to provide reporting capabilities in a very efficient and manner, and to be able to comply and allow the financial institutions to comply with regulations in their own country. And then finally, we know that it's critical to for financial institutions to protect their growth, and so really being able to keep in check the healthy accounts that are being created at the financial institution. So with that, I will open it for questions and turn it back to Lucia to see if we have received any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Céline. I think it was truly insightful and a lot of compelling points and ideas to reflect on. So we have just a few time left. I will go straight to ask what some of you submitted, starting from Pete, if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
The first question is, are there any key differences in how big banks are approaching FAML compared to the approach taken by small banks?
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting one, Lucia, because people often ask, are there geographical differences, or are there differences between different kinds of banks? But I think the biggest one is actually the size of the bank. So an example of that is that big banks, one of the first questions they often have for vendors is, can you import my machine learning model onto your platform? Because often the big banks have developed a very sophisticated and unique machine learning model, particularly for their bank. So it's important to them that they can put their model onto the vendor's platform. Small banks are the complete opposite. Small banks often don't have a machine learning model. It may be the first time they're moving to machine learning. They're often replacing very antiquated systems. So for them, it's important to have something that works out of the box. Now, they will then fine tune it using their data so that it does over time become unique to their bank. But it's a completely 180 degrees different approach. One of them says it's important that you can import our model. The other one says, no, it's important that you can export your model to our bank. And you see various other instances of that in terms of, how important is it about the vendor being able to host or to provide managed services like augmenting the data scientists, augmenting the case investigators. So big banks tend to have lots of resources, but they also have their own unique intellectual property. Small banks, and I'm talking tier 5 credit unions, community banks, Sparkassen, are the polar opposite.
Thank you. The other one is for Guido. They ask, can the features of behavioral analysis and account creation within the context of money mule hunting be utilized for other use cases related to fake users or identity theft?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Thank you. I think that the answer is absolutely yes. So some of the behavioral analysis features we mentioned about the confidence of the user in using its own personal information or the way they interact with some type of form. It's very interesting in several different use cases. So for sure, Money Mule is one of the interesting one. We focused on that one today, and of course, we are focusing on AML in this webinar. At the same time, there are other cases we have seen on our clients being interesting using the same type of technology. I'm thinking about, for example, credit fraud. So very often when you're dealing with credit, you're dealing with unknown users that are asking for some form of credit. And one of the big issues, especially in the split payment type of interaction, is, for example, identity theft. So this type of technology can be used to detect while you are dealing with credit requests, credit application, to detect those type of users that are using someone else's personal information. The same thing is true for coupon fraud. So again, if you want to protect your user base from having a non-productive user, let's say, so users that will just join the service in order to abuse of your coupon policies, this is a very good technology in order to protect your market investment in that area.
Thank you, Guido. And Peter, how can banks increase the productivity of their FAML teams?
Yeah, I mean, that's something where we scratched the surface earlier. I talked about automation to increase productivity, but I think that can take many different forms. There's the very basic ones about, can we just get the workflow more consistent so that inexperienced case investigators know this is step 1, this is step 2, this is decision point A. That at least would get them all working in a consistent fashion, and that would be a big improvement. Then there's slightly more sophisticated things like the scoring having multiple factors. So it isn't a single score. It might be one score for the person and another score for their transaction. So it might say, these transactions look unusual, but Pete, according to our KYC information, is generally regarded as low risk. On the other hand, somebody else might be regarded as high risk. They're a politically exposed person, or they have links to Russia or something, even though their transactions look relatively benign. So there may be that sort of multi-factor scoring. It may also prioritize where to look, telling the case investigator, okay, out of the 100 different data sources we have and the 1,000 different reports, these are the top 3 I would highlight. I think this is where you should start your investigation. So all the time it's prompting, prioritizing, weighting those things in different way, and then doing things like pre-populating reports, not waiting for you to go and grab the data, but pre-populating it. Again, a lot of the advances here are relatively simple. There's an amazing number of banks, well, amazing to me, who still do adverse media by having people sit down and do a Google search. They literally type that person or that company's name in and see just what pops up. So there's, again, those are simple tasks that could be automated and present the results. Again, that's where generative AI, rather than presenting you with 10 different Google-style hits would combine those into a single response.
Thanks. One last question for Guido. It says, in the fight against money muling, could it be beneficial to incorporate information from consortia? Does your platform support this type of integration?
That's another very good point. I think that consortium data, as well as federation, is one of the future challenges, both in fraud and AML. So the quick answer is yes, it can. So we released last year what we call the XTN Federation, and this type of feature is designed to include in the fraud and in the AML analysis we perform on transactions and users, data that comes from interbank consortium like IOFs or IOCs, so indicators of frauds or indicator of compromise. So those information may be useful for sure in the fraud context, but I think also in the AML context, and may give a much more quick way of reacting to new trends or new patterns, both in the fraud space and in the anti-money laundering space, including, of course, money mule hunting. That is one of the topics we have been talking today. So having those consortium data being shared between banks give an additional option to detect mule activity as quick as possible.